Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is, my name is Stephanie Bree, by the way. This is a different type of video than I'm used to doing. This is sort of a rundown of every Nintendo Entertainment System game I played as a kid. This is not going to be a 3-hour long video because, by the way, I did not play very many NES games as a kid. Most of my experience with the NES is after the fact, years later, through emulation, the Wii U, Virtual Console, etc., etc. The GBA Classic Collection and stuff like that. Because we got our NES Christmas of 1988, 88, which is pretty late in the system's life. And because we were relatively poor, we didn't own that many. I will point out which of these games I owned in my childhood. Most of these games I either played at a friend's house or on some occasions got to rent. There are 2 or 3 games missing from this list I did play. I was not able to identify and have not been able to look them up. I just can't seem to find them. I'll do my best to describe them when that comes up. Maybe somebody else watching this video can help me ID them. Obviously, the first 3 games on this list are the Super Mario Brothers, not Bros. If you say Mario Bros, eat shit. I hate it when people say bros. They're not bros. They're not dude bros. They're brothers. Brothers! Jesus Christ. Pisses me off. You sound like a dipshit when you say bros. Anyways. Super Mario Brothers / Duck Hunt was the pack-in that came with my NES. So obviously I owned that as a kid. Super Mario Brothers 2, we've already talked about the history of this elsewhere. This was a game I did not own as a child. I only got to rent it, I'm going to be honest with you, 2, maybe 3 times period in my childhood I rented this game and got to play it. So I didn't get to play it a lot. I got to play it a lot more when I was able to acquire the Super Nintendo Super Mario All-Stars cartridge that had the enhanced 16-bit version of this game. So, in my childhood experiences, this was a 16-bit Super Nintendo game. It was the NES game was something that I briefly experienced a couple of times in my life. But to me, the 16-bit game was the one I played the most. So my memories of this game are as a 16-bit game. Now, Super Mario Bros. 3 was a phenomenon. It was an event. I'm going to be honest with you. People who remember Super Mario Bros. 3 as an event are telling you the truth. It was a legit phenomenon. Pepsi and Shasta both ran Mario 3 promotions at the time. Cheetos and everybody else ran Mario 3 promotions at the time. Talk shows, and the guy on the the 5 o'clock news was talking about Super Mario Bros. 3. This game was a legit phenomenon. Fortunately for those of us who couldn't afford to buy our NES games, this game was popular enough that the video rental stores stocked multiple units. I was able to rent this one considerably more frequently than I was the previously mentioned number 2. So I did play a lot of Super Mario Bros. 3. A lot. A tremendous amount. Did not beat the game as a kid, but this is one I was able to buy a little bit later, mid-Super Nintendo era. I was into the Genesis at the time, hadn't got my SNES yet, but around that time, I was able to pick up a used copy of this game at a yard sale. So this is one I did own as a child. An actual physical cartridge. And I played the shit out of this game. Next up is Tetris. Now, I'm just saying Tetris, but I actually played both versions. I rented the Tengen version once, and I rented the Nintendo version probably 2 or 3 times as a kid. Didn't take me long to get my hands on the Game Boy version, which I had via the Super Game Boy on the SNES, which was how I played this game the most. But I did play a little bit of Tetris on the NES back in the day. Never owned it, Never had any desire to own it. It's not that good of a game, people. So it's highly fucking overrated. But it was still fun back in the day. Next up is Dr. Mario. Now this is one I also rented frequently. I rented this one more frequently than Tetris because in my opinion this is a better game than Tetris. And I liked this game more than Tetris. Better music, better puzzles, better gameplay, better graphics, better visuals. And a hell of a lot more colorful. Plus it's Mario. What are you going to say? This is one that I actually did get various versions of. Some on the Game Boy, some on the SNES, and the Game Boy, some of the GBA versions, as well as the Game Boy, the NES Classic NES series version of the NES version on the Game Boy, or the Game Boy Advance as well. So I've played a lot of Dr. Mario, plus other versions like Dr. Luigi, etc. But the actual NES cartridge I did play back in the day, mostly as a rental. Never owned it. I'm going to talk about these next two games back to back. No pun intended. Back to the Future, rented it once, promptly took it back and said, give me another game to play, and I'm not paying for it. And the clerk was very understanding because obviously I wasn't the first person to do this. The second game, Back to the Future 2 and 3, I rented more than once because it was actually fun. Was it hard and cryptic? Yes. But the core gameplay was fun enough that back in the day we didn't care if we weren't trying to beat the game. We were just trying to play the fucking game. And this game was fun to play. Did I need to beat it? Not really. But it was fun to play. Next up is a game I became obsessed with. To the point that this was the very first game I emulated on a computer when I discovered emulation because I was desperate to replay this game. Because it was not a big seller, which meant a lot of rental stores didn't carry it. So it was very rare I got to play this game. None of my friends were any interested in this game either. It is Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland. I was likewise obsessed with the animated feature film based on the same intellectual property, Little Nemo. Fucking amazing game. I would label this as a hidden gem just because it's a rare game. Didn't sell well, and it's hard to find. If you can get your hands on a copy of Little Nemo, you absolutely should. If you can play it any way you can, do so. It's fan-fucking-tastic. Unfortunately, I was only ever able to rent it at most once or maybe twice in my life because, like I said, most video rental stores didn't stock it. And because we moved a lot, I didn't always have access to the video store that did. Next up is A Nightmare on Elm Street. I've talked about this ad nauseum. Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite film of all time. It is one of my favorite film franchises of all time. Freddy Krueger is one of my favorite horror villains of all time. And this is one of my favorite NES games of all time. That's never going to change. But this is not a game I got to play that much as a kid. Same story. Not a big seller. Not appropriate for children. A lot of video stores wouldn't rent it. Or if they did, they wouldn't rent it to kids. Even though there was no rating system at the time. They kind of felt it was not appropriate for children. Because it kind of sort of wasn't. But also, whatever. So I did play this game a handful of times growing up. Never owned a physical cartridge of it in my entire life. Unfortunately, it's pretty rare, and it's not ultra rare, but it's not an inexpensive game. And it's not one that comes up in retro video game stores very often because people who have it aren't giving it up. Selfish bastards. Next up is Friday the 13th. Now, I will, to a point, defend this game because, one, nostalgia. I did own this game. It was one of a handful of games I did own as a kid. It was the third video game cartridge for the NES my parents bought us, children as kids, to play. Why did they buy us Friday the 13th? I don't know, probably because it was a budget title that was on clearance, is my guess, because this is not, despite what people will try to tell you, a great game. But also, despite what assholes like James Rolfe will try to tell you, it's not a terrible game either. It's a, at best, middle-of-the-road game, which is just fine. But when you're 8 years old, and this is the only game you have to play besides Mario, and the other game I'll talk about when I get to it, you're going to play the shit out of it, but you're not going to have a good time. You're going to be wishing you were playing something else. Next up is the Three Stooges. Now, this is a game, this was a blind buy. I was at a yard sale. Guy had a copy of the Three Stooges for like $3 or $4, something like that. It was like 95, 96. So I was still a kid. I was still a teenager. Still counts. I was like 12 or 13 at the time. Maybe 13, 14 maybe in there. Somewhere in there. Somewhere between 12 and 15. So I was still a kid. So it was a blind buy. It was a yard sale purchase. Excuse me. Took it home. Played it for all of maybe 45 minutes. Tossed it in the closet, never touched it. Rubbish game. Regret buying it, wish I had other games to play. Top Gun, rented it once, took it back, never touched it again, will never play it again, let's move on. Didn't own it. Ninja Gaiden, or Gaiden, depending on how you say it. Just knowing what I know about Japanese, because I studied it in college, I'm inclined to say Gaiden, based on the spelling, because Gaiden would be Geiden. But actually, it would be Gaidenu, I guess, because they don't. Anyways, it's neither here nor there. But I'm gonna say Gaiden because that's what I've heard it as the most, and that's what I'm used to. This was a game I rented once and only once, not because I didn't enjoy it, but because I just was more interested in other games, and I wanted to play other games. I had Shinobi 3, Return of the Ninja Master, at the time I rented this game, so I already had access to a superior side-scrolling action platforming ninja-based game. So this one was kind of, at the time I rented it, because it was late in the NES life. The Genesis and SNES were already on the market. So it was one of those, had I played it earlier in my childhood, I might have globbed onto it sooner. Now, this is one I rediscovered as an adult, thanks to YouTubers, and found out was actually a fun game. But as a kid, I rented it once and never looked back. Mega Man 3 is the only Mega Man game I played on the NES as a kid, and because it was such an awful, miserable experience, I avoided the other Mega Man games for the longest fucking time. I did not own Mega Man 3. I rented it once, had an awful, miserable time the entire weekend I was trying to enjoy this game, couldn't, and never looked back. Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. This is based on a cartoon, based on a movie, but it's complicated. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not a great game. It's not a terrible game. Again, it's a mediocre, middle-of-the-road platformer based on a licensed property. It is what it is. You get what you paid for. This was a game because I loved the cartoon. And yes, I like B-movies. I enjoyed the films. Sue me. I rented this one multiple times because I just liked the property. And I liked the theme song. You know, I'm not going to hum it. You're expecting me to. You're waiting for me to. I'm not going to hum it. But I could. It's in my head. And it is on one of my playlists. I listen to it regularly. It was a fun game. I never owned it, but I did play it a lot. Gremlins 2. I rented this game once or twice. Really loved it. But again, it was a licensed property. Wasn't a super popular movie because Gremlins was a better movie. Gremlins 2 was kind of a wet blanket to children. It was like, oh no, Gremlins. Wait, what? Now, wait, now, huh? Now there's spiders and bats and things? What the fuck? And Hulk Hogan? Give me a break. But Gremlins 2, fine game. Never owned it, only played it a couple of times. Ghostbusters 2, I rented once. Did not have a good time, never played it again, never owned it. Now, Ghostbusters I did own, but not on the NES. I owned the Atari cartridge of the same game, and I owned the Commodore 64 version of the same game. The Commodore 64 version is more or less the NES version. So I did experience that game, just not on the actual NES. So I have to make that clear. I did own the game, I just owned it on the Commodore 64, not on the actual NES. Next up is Star Wars. I love Star Wars. It was my go-to movie rental. Every time I went to the video store, the first thing I did was went straight to the sci-fi section to see if they had Star Wars in stock. Usually they didn't. It was a popular movie. It was always rented out. But when I couldn't get my Star Wars film fix, I would occasionally rent the video game. I did not like this game as a kid. In fact, I hated it as a kid. Too fucking hard. I kept dying. I just didn't enjoy it. Gauntlet. Now, Gauntlet is interesting because I actually had it on the Atari first. So I was mildly familiar with an inferior version of this game. And I got to play the arcade version randomly one time, and I was blown away by how different it was from the Atari version. And then my cousins had this game on the NES. And so I got to play it at their house a few times. I really enjoyed it. Never owned the physical cartridge, but I would say Gauntlet, the NES version, is still an enjoyable experience. Everything I just said about Gauntlet, for the most part, you could copy and paste to Joust. It's another game I had on the Atari. Got to play it a couple of times in the arcade. Rented it once from the video rental store. Played it, the NES version. Good, solid version of the game. Loved it. Never owned it. Paperboy, another one I rented once. Didn't enjoy it, but played it regularly at my friend's house who had a copy of it because it was the only game he had. And so we played it regularly because it was like, what else are you going to do? Never liked Paperboy. Let's move on. RBI Baseball I rented once, and the only reason I rented it was because it was the only game they had in stock that weekend, because, you know, a lot of these small town video rental stores, well, they rent out. They sell out quick. Friday night, everything's gone. What are you left with? RBI Baseball. Game sucked. Let's not talk about it. Street Fighter 2010. This was another yard sale blind buy. It was a kid was selling this and Total Recall. I bought them both the same day, which I'll talk about Total Recall in a minute. Played the shit out of this game. Did not enjoy it, but because I only had a handful of games on the NES, I played it quite frequently because I was desperate to have anything to play. Now, partially due to nostalgia and partially due to hypocrites who will call one game bad because it's too hard and another game the greatest gift to humanity even though it's also too hard, I'll call bullshit to anyone who says this is a bad game because it's too hard. Eat shit. If you're going to say this game is bad but Battletoads is good, fuck off. Now, if you're going to say this is a bad game because poor level design or generic enemies, etc., okay, I'll give you that. But if your problem with it is it's too hard, fuck off. All NES games were too hard. Jesus Christ. But, is it a good game? I don't know. Because I only played it as a kid when I was bored and was tired of playing the other 5 or 6 NES games I had. Didn't enjoy it, but I've never revisited it. So I can't say yes or no, is it a good game. All I'll say is you cannot criticize it for being too hard. That is never, ever an acceptable criticism of an NES game. Ever. Because they're all too hard. All of them. Moving on. Iron Tank. This is one me and my cousin rented one weekend, and we played it until 5 or 6 in the morning. We just stayed up all night playing this game. It was a blast. Only rented it the one time because I really didn't get along with that particular cousin. And by way of divorce, he wasn't a cousin for very long. Well, I mean, technically speaking, he's still my cousin, kind of, sort of. But it is what it is. So I only played it the one time, never owned it, never played it again. I couldn't tell you if it's a good game today. I just had a blast that one time I played it. Silver Surfer. I had an asshole friend, and I'm calling him an asshole because he loved the Silver Surfer, and who the fuck loves the Silver Surfer? And he forced me to spend my money renting this piece of shit one weekend because he begged me. He said, "Oh, the Silver Surfer's great. It's going to be an awesome game." He was wrong. He was so fucking wrong. Rented it the one time. Didn't stay friends with this asshole for very long, thank God. Never rented it again. Never owned it. Will never play it again. Uncanny X-Men. Yeah, it's a bad game. It is. I'm going to admit it. But I enjoyed it. I love the X-Men. What are you going to do about it? I rented it as many times as I could. Even though it wasn't fun to play the game, it was still fun to be the X-Men. That's all I wanted when I was 7 years old. I just wanted to be Cyclops. And this game let me be Cyclops. So, is it a good game? No. Is it a good experience? If you're a fan of Cyclops and he's your favorite X-Men character? Yeah. That's not everybody, though. Here's a game I rented once. When my parents found out I rented it, they beat my ass for renting it, told me to never rent it again, because it's satanic. And I'm going to be honest, it wasn't that fun to begin with, so I was just like, whatever, Mom. It's called Taboo. I couldn't tell you what the fuck this game is to this day. I rented it, and Mom had a conniption fit when she found out I rented it. So, there you go. I don't know. Is it a good game or not? I couldn't tell you. Now, these next 3 games I'm going to run through together because they're sort of, kind of a trilogy. Loosely. Not exactly, but kind of, sort of. TMNT, TMNT 2, the arcade game, and TMNT 3, the Manhattan Project. TMNT I rented a few times. Probably 3 or 4 times. It was fun. I love Ninja Turtles. I was obsessed with Ninja Turtles. So I rented it. I had a blast. Was it a hard game? Yes. Is it a bad game? Not bad. But it's not a great game. Don't let the assholes who tell you that this is secretly a hidden gem. It isn't. It's a mediocre game. It's just not as bad as some people say. But it's also not as good as other people try to tell you. Excuse me. Now, TMNT 2 is actually a legit good game, based on a legit good arcade game. I've played both extensively. I did own TMNT 2, the arcade game, physical cartridge. I bought it from I don't know, not a Blockbuster, but one of those local chains, video rental stores. When they were clearancing out their NES games, I was able to get a used copy, pretty good price. This was like right around the time the N64 was coming out, so they were clearancing their NES titles, which is around the time I got the most NES cartridges I had as a kid. Great game. I'll say it, better than the arcade version. Graphically, not better than the arcade version, but better than the arcade version. You get more content. You get a better game. Yeah, it's not 4-player, but it's got way better levels, way better bosses, way better action, way better music. TMNT 3, I played it at a friend's house once. Really enjoyed it. Never could find it available to rent. Wasn't a big seller. Never able to track down a used copy at a reasonable price. Never owned it. Castlevania. I rented it once. I hated this game the first time I played it. Here's why. Bear with me. I'm deathly terrified of dogs. The very first thing you do when you start this game up is you encounter a dog. And he kills you. And I threw this game in the closet and I was like, fuck you, I'm not playing a game where I'm going to get my ass kicked by a dog within the first 30 seconds of turning the cartridge on. So no, I had a miserable experience the first time I played Castlevania. Did not play it again on the NES ever. Never owned this cartridge. I eventually played the NES version years later as a grown adult after I played Symphony of the Night and Super Castlevania 4 and Bloodlines, and you know, the Castlevania franchise grew on me, and I went back and revisited on the GBA. They had the classic NES cartridge I bought, and then I enjoyed it. Once you get past that goddamn dog, you find out it's a good game. Why on earth would your game designer make a dog the very first enemy in a video game? It's like making a spider the first enemy in a video game. If you're terrified of spiders, which yes, I also am. Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. Anyways, never owned Castlevania on NES, but I did own the NES version on the GBA. So does that count? No, but it is what it is. Ghosts and Goblins I rented a couple of times, but I actually ended up playing the Genesis game, which I think is a sequel, more, because my friend had it. I did own the Genesis cartridge, never owned the NES cartridge. From what I remember, and I could be far off on this, they're basically the same game. I mean, they're not exactly the same game, but they're basically the same game. Wizards and Warriors was another one I enjoyed the hell out of and would rent it every opportunity I got. Unfortunately, it was not a big seller, and I didn't have a lot of chances to rent it because it wasn't always available. These next two games, I'm not going to even talk about. I own Zelda. I own Zelda 2. You did too. We all did. Moving on. Rampage. I rented this one time because I liked the arcade game. Was immediately disappointed this was not the arcade version. Didn't play it more than a couple of minutes and turned it off. Pac-Man is Pac-Man. Yes, I own the cartridge. 2 or 3 different versions. I had the Namco one. I had the Tengen one. I had another one. Miss Pac-Man, same thing. If it exists on a game console and I own that game console, I will own Miss Pac-Man. Yes, that's always going to happen. I own it on my PS4. Yeah. Super powerful, high definition PlayStation 4. And I'm playing Miss Pac-Man from 1982. Alright. Now, this game is, I believe, pronounced Xyz. It's Hudson Soft. It's spelled all caps XCXYZ. It's a good game, but I'm filing this under Hidden Gems. This was one of the 3 games my parents bought from that video store that was going out of business, and they got it on clearance. The other one was Friday the 13th. So yeah, this was a game that we just happened into. I have never met another person in my life that has heard of this game or played this game. Never have. I enjoyed it. It's a legit good game. If you get a chance to check it out, do so. But you might pay a pretty penny for it to get a physical cartridge on the actual NES. And I don't know if it's good enough for that. I don't think it... Hidden Gem, yes, and a delight, but probably not worth the price of admission. So this is one you're going to want to emulate if you can, if you want to experience it. Batman, I rented it every chance I got. I owned it at one point in time, played the shit out of it, had it on Sega Genesis. Who didn't? Battletoads, I rented once on the NES. All other times I rented it was on the Genesis. I preferred the Genesis version. Didn't really like the NES version that much. Never played it all that much. Never owned it. Total Recall was the other game I got from that yard sale where I ended up getting Street Fighter 2010. Also, not a good game. I'm going to be upfront with you. But I played the crap out of it because what are you going to do? You got 4 games to play, you're going to play the fucking games you have. You ain't got nothing else. Double Dragon, I rented once. Here's the thing with Double Dragon. I saw the commercial for it all the time. And I desperately wanted to play Double Dragon. I was brainwashed by the marketing. Double Dragon is the game you want to play. I watched the cartoon and the live-action movie before I ever got to play the NES game. And when I did rent it the one time I did, I rented it from a video game store at a time where they probably should have already clearanced it because the Super Nintendo was old hat. The N64 just came out. So they shouldn't have even still been renting it, but they were. But they weren't selling it for whatever reason. So I rented it. I played it the one time. It wasn't a miserable experience. I didn't discover this game fully until years later as an adult when I got to play the ROM. And I found out it was actually a legit good game. But like I said, I was bombarded with marketing for this game. So I had a lot of hype in my brain. It did not live up to the hype. Was it a bad game? No. But it didn't live up to the hype, unfortunately. Next, we have 3D World Runner. This was a game my dad rented once for me because he picked it out one time. I was homesick, and I asked him to go to the store and rent me a video game, and he did. This is what he brought home. I played it. It was fun. Never owned it. We'll never play it again. It's not great. It's just sort of like, it is what it is. Blades of Steel was a game one of my friends had and was obsessed with for some ungodly reason. So even though I, at the time, hated this game, I played the shit out of it because it was the only game he had. It was the only game he'd play. I mean, he had other games, but the other games he had, I also had. So this was the only game he had I didn't have. So this was the one we played. You can't play Zelda 2-player. And by this point in the NES life, we were kind of over Super Mario Brothers. We were like, okay, played it enough, don't want to play it again. NES World Cup came on a cartridge with Super Spike V-Ball. It was a 2-for-1 cartridge. I played both games. Hated the World Cup game. Hated the volleyball game. I don't want to talk about it. Duck Hunt was included on my Super Mario cartridge pack-in. I played the shit out of this game, so yes, I owned it. I played it all the time. Love it. RoboCop and RoboCop 2. I rented RoboCop once. It was really fun, but also really hard. But I didn't have enough of an interest to try to rent it more than once. To go back and replay it, I was just kind of like, okay, that was fun. And then I rented RoboCop 2. I'm going to say 2 or 3 times as a kid, because I actually, maybe blasphemy to some people, I actually liked RoboCop 2 as a movie better than RoboCop 1. As a kid. Things may or may not be different today, I don't know, I'm not going to talk about it. But, I played the crap out of this game. Never owned it. Last game I played on the NES as a kid that I can identify. There are 3 games I can't identify. To this day, I've never been able to identify these other 3 games. But Captain Planet was a cartoon I was obsessed with, and so I rented the game. Huge ass mistake. Do not play this fucking piece of shit. You will fucking regret it. You will throw the cartridge and the controller and the console at the wall, and then you're crying because you just broke things you didn't want to break or didn't have permission to break. Oops. Shit happens. What are you going to do? Oh, you're going to do what I did. You're going to get a summer job, and you're going to save up money to pay a repairman to fix the NES because it doesn't belong to you, and your parents are going to beat your ass daily until you do. That's what you're going to do. Don't rent this fucking game. Don't play this fucking game. Now, here's the 3 games I played as a kid I cannot identify. One of them is a shoot-'em-up. It is not the one that was on TurboGrafx 16 and Fantasy Zone. It is not Fantasy Zone. It is not Fantasy Zone. Every time I describe this game to people, they tell me, yeah, that's Fantasy Zone. No, I played Fantasy Zone. It is not Fantasy Zone. But it is very similar to Fantasy Zone. It is a shoot 'em up. It is a side-scrolling shoot 'em up that has above ground and underwater levels. Well, kind of. I'm not describing it well because I don't remember it well. I rented it one time. You're flying in a helicopter, spaceship, bubble craft type thing that can fly in the space or air and shoot at, I don't know, airplanes or birds or aliens or whatever. But it can also shoot, I guess, torpedoes or something at the enemies that are in the underwater. I don't know how to describe the game. I only played it once. But it is absolutely not fucking Fantasy Zone. So if you come at me with, no, that's Fantasy Zone, eat shit. The second game I played as a kid, I also only played it once. And I cannot remember enough about it to describe it to the Google or internet forums well enough to be able to identify it. It was an underground type game. So you were underground, you were in like a cave or something, and you were breaking bricks with like a shovel or something, and no, it's not Solomon's Key. You were breaking bricks with like a shovel or something, and you were relocating the bricks, and I know it's not Bomberman either. But I don't remember anything else about it, and I've never been able to identify it. So, yet again, So, unfortunately, that's as best as I can remember it, as best as I can describe it. I know it was an NES game because I was playing it at my friend's house, and we played it in between a session of The Legend of Zelda and a session of Rampage, which, again, I've already talked about. I've never been able to ID this game. The third NES game that I played as a kid that I cannot identify was a generic racing game. I used to think it was Pole Position until I realized Pole Position wasn't on the NES. It is not Rad Racer, but I couldn't tell you anything more than that. It's a racing game. I've never been able to identify it. Those are every single 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System game I played as a kid in my childhood. Now, I've since played dozens and dozens and dozens of NES games as an adult via emulation through the Virtual Console, etc. But those are all the ones I played as a child, and like I said, only a few of those were games I actually physically owned at some point in time or another. Stay cool.